it should be noted that there is some disagreement, however you want to say, amongst many scripture scholars on who the author of these letters of St. Paul to Timothy and Titus really is. Some will say that it is Paul, it's obviously Paul. Some will say that it is some other one using Paul's name. And if I recall correctly from my days in seminary, I think at that time they were saying the majority of people say that it's probably not written by Paul. But when they say that majority, there was like 55% or something like that. So not like a super majority, not like a vast, overwhelming amount, but still the majority say that it's not St. Paul. And there are arguments on either side of why they might think one way or the other, and part of the reason that they don't think it's St. Paul is they say he's writing very different style, very different vocabulary, and he's writing about things which seem later in the life of the church, not necessarily first century, but second century. And again, in my opinion, there are still very many good responses to those critiques or those arguments where you can say that obviously Paul is writing to individuals, to leaders of the church, to those whom he has set up as leaders, as overseers, as bishops, basically. And not to entire churches themselves, not to the church in Corinth and all the people thereof, but to individuals. And so that writing style is going to look different. It's also obviously later in the life of St. Paul. And if you ever look back at things that you wrote even 3 years ago, let alone a decade or more, you know how much your writing style can change depending on circumstances of your life and what's going on. And it's also very possible that Paul was using a different scribe. And it's very well known that he had scribes writing for him, and perhaps they use some of their own paraphrasing or terms within those writings to make clear what Paul is dictating. And at this point, his original scribe would be somebody who is either different or he's writing this with his own hands and not using a scribe. There are many reasons for those textual differences, but the contextual differences, I think, is another story that is worth exploring, because again, people will say that he seems to be writing more about things that happen later in the life of the church, and some will say he's writing with more terminology that's used later in that second century. And yet, even more recent study and delving into this question will still make that question muddier in some ways, because when is that divide between first and second century styles of writing? And there are, again, scriptural scholars and scholars of those old ancient documents who will look at it and say, no, there are writings from the first century which match the style in which Paul is writing here. And it's also very possible that that second century style of writing took its inspiration from Paul and how he wrote here. But in regards to those actual activities of the church, where there are those who will say, he is very clearly talking about things in the church life, like bishops, overseers, as he mentions, the episcopoi, or elders, presbyterate, the priests, and he speaks about deacons. And if he is talking in these lines, many will say, well, that came a little bit later in the life of the church to have that structural organization. In those first years, there was more of that still growing into that period. And yet again, remember that this is still later in the life of St. Paul. And again, we have, even in that first reading from his letter to Titus, even in the very beginning, he is speaking about appointing those presbyters. And he is very clearly speaking to Titus as the overseer, as the episcopoi, as the bishop. It is not in Titus's letter that he talks about deacons, but in his letters to St. Timothy. And I think it is then that question, How original are those offices in the church? And I think part of my concern with those who are quick to say, well, it can't be St. Paul, because that happens a little bit later, are sometimes not giving enough credit to that reality of the apostles and the work that they were doing in organizing the structure and everything that comes with it. And I think at times it certainly can be the devil, the evil spirits, who want to do whatever they can to undermine the church and that trust in the church and its structure and its organization and its authority. And if they can call into question, did Paul really write this? Then there's going to be that question, well, if he didn't really write it, well, maybe those structures of the church are not as original as we maybe once thought. And if they're not as original as we once thought, maybe they're not authentic. And if they're not authentic, maybe I don't have to follow them. And then you get Protestantism, and you get many who have rejected those structures and all of its various forms of congregationalism and all these other aspects. We can't respond. We can't say fully one way or the other who actually wrote this. We can't go back in time and look at it. We can know from other things. I mean, St. Paul's letters to Timothy and Titus were quoted in that 2nd century by early disciples, even people who knew St. Paul himself, as letters of St. Paul, as authentic. Then you'd think that if it was somebody else who was writing in his name or somebody who was pretending to be him, a forgery, that they would have been pretty aware of that and called it out. And again, those early church fathers in those early years would have been far more familiar with the Greek and its contexts and its nuances than any of us studying it now. And they never thought it was odd or weird or wasn't Paul. It wasn't until, again, centuries and centuries later that question even came up at all. Is this really St. Paul? And so if we can't know for sure, it seems to me that we should just trust in those early founders of the church and the faith of our fathers, that they believed it was from St. Paul. And they believed with good reason. And we should trust their reasons rather than ours, or our questions or our concerns. So that those questions, those perhaps subtle attacks of the devil might not undermine our faith, might not call into question what God has given, what God has revealed, and might then lead us astray. But that our faith may be in what has been given, what has been handed on, what has been entrusted to us. And that by that faith, we might trust not in ourselves, not in fallible studies or even doctorate dissertations, but in God and in Him alone. That faith might be real, that faith might be true, that faith then might move hearts to true conversion, to true love, and to true discipleship in Jesus Christ and in the church that He has founded and that He has organized and that He continues to lead to this day.